Welcome to Pray for Micah. And now your host, Micah Chrisman.
Welcome to the Pray for Micah podcast. Today's prayers are sponsored by the Boys and Girls Choir of the Mormon Tabernacle of the Singing Gazelles. This is not a real group and neither are these sponsorships, but if it happens to exist, just know that the copyright infringement is not intentional. But the prayers are still welcome. Today, we're welcoming Nathaniel Bozarth onto the show. He is a film producer, public speaker, and a data scientist. He's working to move racial equity to the center of culture. Daniel, how are you doing today?
I'm good. How are you, Mike? Thanks for having me.
Good, man. Really glad to have you here. We were just talking about how I'm still drying my hair. I'm still trying to, let the makeup sit from my morning. I'm not, it's funny because I started doing this with my friend Josh Casey, and he has to do it really late at night, recording the podcast episode. So when his wife and kids are going to sleep, we're doing it like his time. It's like 11 o'clock his time, and it's like 10 o'clock my time. And so, yeah, our episodes were like kind of just, red-eyed. And so you look well this morning. You look like you're ready for the morning hangs.
Well, thanks. Yeah, I actually record, so it's not even that late. I do podcast recording sometimes at 8 p.m. and I notice that I feel like my brain starts to already slow down at that point. I'm not as sharp, but you got me at my sharpest.
Yeah,
I feel good right now.
And, I'm always wanting people when they're sharpest, because otherwise, when they're dull, So how the hell you been, man? We haven't hung out and talked a while. I mean, it's been a pandemic and whatnot.
Yeah, I'm pretty good, man. My wife's immune compromised, so I do find myself like largely at home still. So I am fully at this point used to the quarantine life, used to Zoom. I'm very glad. I feel really good about my marriage that my wife and I have been in the same house for so long and had no people. We actually moved and we've had no one else in our house, which is really sad. We miss like having parties and having people over. But it feels good that our relationship feels healthy and we're not sick of each other. It's like, wow, that's great. I'm glad.
Wow, that's wonderful. So where'd you all move? You're not in the Ivanhoe neighborhood anymore?
Oh no, we moved to Ivanhoe. Yeah, we were in Hyde Park, moved to Ivanhoe. Yeah, and it's great. Yeah.
Doing any gardening over there? I guess there's.
Oh man, we should. It's funny. Like there are so. It's so beautiful how many community gardens there are around us. Even community gardens notwithstanding, we tried to do a potted garden in our backyard, which went okay. We're having a lot of like late season tomatoes, which we're not sure if they're going to ripen or not. We're learning a lot. I think I fertilized them at the wrong time or something.
Yeah, I have my own little home mini garden in the backyard, and I swear I just grow things so that nature can eat it. That's what I've determined. I had some good chard for a minute that I was able to harvest, but then next time I go out, all the locusts had like been chewing holes or whatever, and they were pretty much devoured before I got those. Same thing with
what do you eat chard with?
I'll just do it. I'll just saute it. Yeah, I just kind of whatever. I make it like a bed of veggies for usually whatever meat I'm deciding to eat, that chicken or beef. But yeah, I don't know. I've never really learned great recipes for chard. I always just do some olive oil, salt, and pepper, and sometimes I've grilled it. That's really fun. Just
cool.
I mean, I do the same thing: salt, pepper, olive oil, but then I just throw it on my grill while my other meats are cooking.
Nice. Good greens.
I pretend to be healthy by growing things in my backyard, but then, like I said, then I go out to get my tomatoes, and I realize, oh, this one's already half eaten by whatever bugs are out here.
Man, when you get a good tomato, though, I swear there is something truly magical about getting a tomato off the vine. Nothing's touched it, except nature itself. It's still like warm from the sun. Oh my gosh, I love that. It's like, that's bliss. That's my bliss.
And then I made the mistake of not getting a tomato cage for them early on in the season.
Yeah.
So they were like laying down, and I was using twine to try to hang them back up. Lost probably half my tomatoes just trying to finagle.
Oh no.
I had like 10 green tomatoes that I told myself, well, I'll just make fried green tomatoes because I have so many green tomatoes, and then just never made it. And then but I do take my compost to Cherith Brook. So I just,
nice.
At some point I'm like, it all goes back to the earth. So if I can just take it back to the compost, they'll use it in their garden. I don't feel so bad for ruining half the fruit I grow.
Hey, yeah, that's huge. Yeah, I feel really bad. I'd really like to get into composting. I have this like part of me that is consciously like, there's like just enough consciousness that I feel really bad every time I throw like food waste, like a banana peel or something down the trash, and realizing that's going to be sequestered forever in a landfill. But not enough that we've actually started composting. So I need to start actually composting.
Tell you what, it's a stinky business. Like, you have to make sure you're on top of, taking it somewhere. Like I said, if I had started my own compost, I would be just turning it and, in the backyard. But I guess it's really warm in the winter. So fun fact for those survivalists, for the people who listen to the show who are preppers, I mean, the one or two that are, if you're in the middle of a winter and you're freezing to death, you can find it. If you find a compost pile, you need to just crawl right to the center of it, because all that nitrogen cooking, well, maybe not in the center of it, but kind of do just do the Star Wars thing where you just like wrap yourself, like
from Empire Strikes Back.
Just wrap yourself in the compost, and you'll keep warm all night, and you'll stay safe.
Nice, like steamy compost.
Hey, but I'm so glad you and your wife have just been able to ride out this pandemic, doing well together.
Yeah.
What I've wanted to kind of get into like some of the projects and things you've been working on. I follow you on Instagram, get your little vignettes, your kind of little daily reminders of doing self-work, dismantling white supremacy. And I just wanted to ask you just kind of what inspired you to start doing that work? Just like even like the just small pieces that you're putting out there, the kind of low content bits that I've really appreciated.
Yeah, thanks, man. I think for me, so much of my work has been a product of kind of self-discovery and feeling a sense of awe or sometimes anger, sometimes deep sadness about the things that I learned incorrectly, and then just having a drive to take others along in that process. I think I've always been a really reflective person and always a really open person. I think that's sort of one of my superpowers, is that I'm like, I have very little, I guess I have maybe a naive lack of fear to just expose myself in that way. So as I learn and grow, I really want to take people along in that process. And I think at some point in 2020, I was talking with a friend of mine, John Bakura, and I don't know how it came up in our conversation, but there was some idea that like, what if people were just reminded and took a few, I think what I saw in white people in 2020, and I know that many other people observe this as well, it's like there's this big upsurge of white people who were interested in racial justice, who were protesting in the wake of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery being brutalized, being murdered by police. And there was this renewed interest. And I've heard therapists say that some of that renewed or that new interest in things of justice was perhaps predicated on the collective trauma that we were experiencing at the beginning of the pandemic. And there was an almost equalizing factor. But then later, many white people lost interest. it seemed like things went back to normal, and we certainly didn't. It doesn't seem to me like we've had huge strides forward since then. So I think that part of my hope by posting little snippets of self-reflection and or thoughts about racial justice is meant to remind people, hey, this is still happening. Like, racism is still something we need to fight every day. We can't just stop, because I think that's what we saw, or are seeing. So I think it's in a way trying to continue a momentum.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think when we think about the protests and how many people showed up even here in Kansas City on the plaza, and then, some folks were just, we know are going to just come to get their selfie and we won't see them again until there's another protest. And yet, I don't know, to me, there were some people who were taking the stance of no one doing serious, anti-racism work is showing up to protest. And to me, I just thought, hey, these people showed up, like whether it was, a moment of just vainglory or maybe misconstrued like purpose. At the end of the day, I think people have to start somewhere on their journey to coming into realizing that this is something wrong and broken in our society, and at least I'm going to show up for it. But then what goes on beyond the moment and moves into the movement is the critical work, as we would know. But I guess I'm curious, like, what does that look like? What do your videos speak to that is moving folks from that, just moving beyond a moment of like 2020 and that collective consciousness, awareness now of maybe that there's something wrong, broken in our society, white supremacist murders, and moving them into this movement work? Where does that direction you think should be heading towards?
I think for white people, it's that it has to be deeply personal, and it has to be self-work. I was having a recent conversation with Dr. Carmelita Williams of the Black Archives, and in our conversation, we were talking about how, especially for white folks in power, the drive to build and maintain white supremacy is fundamentally connected to the ego, and connected to a really lack of a sense of self for white people that is divorced from whiteness, that there is a clinging to whiteness that white people have as their whole sense of self, so that if there doesn't exist a lower class of people, a different race, then your sense of self is threatened. And this is something else that like a really formative moment for me in high school was reading Chinua Achebe's critique of Heart of Darkness, where he levies that like, look, the European project has been a project of feeling okay about themselves by deriding Africa as less than and primitive, etc. So I think this is something that's deeply embedded in the white psyche. I think that white people have to do self-work to move past that, to become, as some authors have said, to become less white, but certainly to have a sense of self that is more whole and grounded in a reality and not a fiction.
Yeah, I think this is something that, I'm part of the Open Tables, like anti-racism cohort. We've been working on this kind of follow-up curriculum around internalized racial superiority. That year-long process of just working with this subgroup to flesh out what that training would look like was a real, I feel like, wrestling time for even us, like even for me, just thinking about, well, there's both like internalized racial superiority and internalized racial inferiority. And so I think that's where the folks of color in our cohort have really tried to understand even their own, how they show up into the presence of white folks, and how does that inferiority take a place, come to the forefront, and make them feel like they have to follow that, like you're saying, that kind of pre-written script of I must be quiet, the white man has started speaking at the meeting, and just the subconscious ways we're socialized into these conditioned mindsets.
Yeah.
Or what it means for me as a white person to show up and realize my tendencies to take up space and not, think about how my presence is impacting the work that's happening right now.
Yeah.
And yet at the same time, I don't know about you, but I was listening to one of your clips. You were talking about going to church with Calvin Arsenia, younger. And I think part of my journey where I'm wrestling with this work of anti-racism work is trying to disentangle myself from the shame culture that we grew up with in the church.
Yes.
This idea that I am this worm, I'm no one, God's here to just, almost like some sadist, self-flagellation kind of thing. And I've never taken this work and anti-racism work as that extreme, but there are moments where you realize that there does take some resiliency to do that self-work you're talking about, and do it in a way that at the end of the day is supposed to kind of really move you beyond shame. No one wants Micah just to show up and feel sorry for himself. That doesn't solve anybody's problems. But anyways, I'm curious to hear more of your thoughts about that. How do white folks do this self-work, and then if they have that Christian kind of trauma or just religious trauma, might not be Christian, might be other shame culture religions,
Sure. Yeah. Well, one, I think that something that comes to mind is that shame isn't sustainable. That shame, both in the church, even when I so I'll just claim where I am. So I grew up in a very charismatic evangelical Christian environment. If I put a label on myself now, I would use the label ex-evangelical, buzzword. I certainly am, do consider myself to continue to be spiritual, but certainly not in the same way, and certainly in a, very different than what I grew up with. I wouldn't lightly take the word. I couldn't claim the word or would want to claim the word Christian at this point. So in the church, growing up, I do feel like shame was a big part of my experience. And I think both then and now, shame doesn't work as a sustainable motivator or driver. So if people are trying to do the work of anti-racism and do the inner work of racial justice, as Rhonda V. McGee calls it, if the motivation is shame, it's going to be temporary and not lasting. So it can't be that. And I think where I've struggled with that is that when I've gotten when I've had the chance to have a pulpit, when I've been on stage, I find myself wanting to make white people feel guilt and shame. I find myself thinking kind of automatically that without thinking, subconsciously, that seems to be the direction that I have gone to try to make people feel bad. And I've realized more recently, starting with that conversation I had a little while back with Calvin Arsenia, that perhaps that's been horribly misguided, and I hadn't connected it to my experience of the church growing up. But I now see them as just totally intertwined, and it's part of the work I have to do now to disentangle those things and think about doing my inner work, inviting other white people to do the inner work in a way that is about freedom, about wholeness, about becoming a more whole person. And I think there's a interesting complexity there, because as a white person, doing the work of racial justice is about making a better world for our brothers and sisters of color. And it's also about becoming more free myself. Because when we're all more free, what's the phrase? I'm not free until everyone's free. There's I can't remember that phrase, but it's something like that.
I'm the worst when it comes to, I'll quote people and misquote this, but I knew the intention of the quote, I think, you hit something on the head for me, thinking about when I first was kind of, awakened to this work, was when Mike Brown was killed in Ferguson, and I was in college at the time. And I was in grad school, so I was teaching public speaking to the students. And I remember one of my students giving me his deployment papers because he was in the National Guard. And he was telling me how he was going to have to go to the armory at 3 a.m. and that he wouldn't be back for 3 days. And when he came back, him and some other students, he had been in the National Guards. I mean, we're talking about he's 19 years old at the time, something pretty young. There's other students who lived there, who just went home during that time. I think this was during when Officer, what's his face, was not acquitted, or was acquitted, was not indicted, and there was the uprising and more protests happening. Anyways, he came back and he shares with me how he was on the front line. This is the National Guard student, and how he was telling me how he almost drew his gun on somebody because, he's on the shield wall and someone reached behind their back and they chucked a water bottle at him. And just that moment, he's sharing about this moment of the split second of not drawing his gun and killing somebody. I realized, oh my God, this is like a microcosm of the whole thing, right? Of like this, just this specific situation, the idea that we see a threat where there may not be one. And we're literally, as a culture, pitting these youth against each other, police against other teenagers or other people who are protesting. And I don't know, that was just my first time kind of coming to recognize that. And so starting that journey of wanting to learn more about Black Lives Matter and how that was forming from even like a communication standpoint, because that's what I was studying, it was really easy to start wielding that knowledge against family, against friends. And man, you need to get off, whatever it is you're on and start open your eyes to what's going on. And like you said, I don't think I realized how much that was harming the movement work of just trying to jump in and be this kind of know-it-all, and not, that was speaking from my perspective. And it was good intentions of like wanting to raise awareness about this issue and realizing how blind I had been to it and complicit in this system, and realizing for the first time, I need to talk about this. And yet didn't have like a lot of the tools to talk about it. So, but yeah, you have thoughts on that before?
Sure. Yeah. Well, it's so complex, because I think a phrase that comes to mind is that we need everyone in this movement, right? Like we need all types of people, and we need all types of efforts in order to make change. So we were talking about protest earlier. Like we do need people out protesting, and we need people behind the scenes doing things. I don't know if we need black boxes on Instagram, but we need all these other efforts. And maybe there's a space that we need people like Jane Elliott, who definitely uses the shame approach with white people in her speeches. She's the famed educator who did the brown eyes, blue eyes experiments in Aurora, Iowa school to model to white kids what discrimination feels like. She definitely goes that shame approach, but we also need other people. So it could be that there's a little bit of both. And I think what I've noticed in myself is that where there was a time when if someone talked, it still is kind of true. It's complex. If someone talks about empathy, if I'm talking to one-on-one with a white person, and they say, and I say something about, I want white people to understand the historic evils as they affect the present, so that we can create better policy, so that we can have a more equitable and just present. And then they start going on about empathy and how our society is so polarized. It's a red flag for me, because I'm like, hold on, like this sounds like you're trying to both sides this argument. This sounds like you're trying to acquit yourself. I think there's probably a different way to do empathy. And that empathy is a sort of empathy that cares for the whole person, for all people more wholly, perhaps. Like there are people that talk about how us white people, we have trauma with regards to the narrative of racial hierarchy. And that's some of the self-work, is to heal our trauma, even though our trauma in no way can be of the same character, or I would say like as bad as the trauma that has befallen, that we have committed against Black people and other people of color. I lost my train of thought. That was really anticlimactic.
Hey,
I can't. What was it?
I kind of resonate with what you're saying, thinking about how do we restore our humanity as white people, because we don't even realize that part of us that has been lost, of generational, just the superiority, this idea that, I mean, you can almost say the same thing just even as us as white men. Like there's a whole, we could explore that dynamic. Right now we're kind of talking about race, but even as being healed from toxic masculinity, that hey, there's this, again, pre-written script of what it means to be a man, and how demoralizing that really is to our human psyche. We don't.
I have a really good example, like a really concrete example of thinking about the intersectionality of being white and male, and with regards to race. So I have this history of like you said, being a public speaker, being a film producer and podcast producer in the space of racial justice, with emphasis on the history of segregation and real estate. So there was a company that wanted to move their business onto Troost Avenue from a previous location. And they asked me for my advice on how to do it well. And I gave an answer. It was via email. I gave some thoughts. I provided a few other people that they might reach out to. But it didn't go very well for them. There was a lot of backlash. In fact, my wife, who's not white, heard about it. It was among the people who was quite upset about it. This company's move, and then I told her, like, that's interesting because I actually was sort of involved. Like, they asked for my thoughts on it. And something that someone told me when I was kind of discussing this and discussing even how I was feeling about it, like discussing like, man, I feel bad. I feel guilty. I feel like that how could I have done better? Seeing now that there's backlash from the community, seeing that there's very much concern about how they're moving. How could I have, prepared the business for this more? How could I have given them better counsel? And someone commented and said, like, you know what you should have done, Nathaniel, is you should have not answered. As a white male, like, perhaps you felt that you have to answer. Perhaps that's what you've been taught by society, that as a white male, you have to have an answer. In this case, however, it may have been the most appropriate thing for you to do to say, I don't know, don't ask me. Like, here's some other people you could ask. And I thought that was a huge point of growing for me, like to realize just that new freedom. So that's a freedom that I have that I didn't used to have, that like, man, I don't have to have the answer. I can sort of, I don't know if that's giving away my power, but it's certainly just having a recognition of like what my strengths and weaknesses are, what my gifts are, like what I have to give the world, and when it's appropriate for me when it's most appropriate for me to say, like, no, don't ask me, like, I'm not your guy.
Right. Wow. It's powerful. I was, on top of just being a white male, but just a carbon-based life form in general, it's like, it's really nice to not realize, that's what I was sharing with somebody about, even just from the faith perspective. It's great to not have this idea of like, this like Christian hegemonic, I have the answer, you all, and just growing up with this perpetual need to have answers for all these big life questions.
I have the answer. It's Jesus. Just say that. That always happened in like Sunday school. like where they would say like there would be some question and then everyone would just want to say Jesus, and like the teacher would be like, no, the answer isn't always Jesus, or I don't know. So that was like an inside my head joke that didn't fly.
That's how it was with my parents. I'd get done with Sunday school. What'd you learn today, Micah? And if I wasn't paying attention that day, I would say, well, about Jesus. And one day she was like, Micah, what about Jesus? What more? His relationship with the Holy Spirit. Oh, okay. That's something. Okay.
Be more specific.
And I know you see yourself like you're an artist, you're a creative person. You've got your podcast I'd like to talk more about, Why It Ruled. But something just speaking to the idea of how this work can bring liberation even for us white males.
Yeah.
I can't remember. This is going to be the moment where I try to bring up a quote of somebody and botched up, but the idea behind, I don't remember who said it, but the purpose of art is to make the revolution irresistible. Something along those lines. And I love that. I just think that there's something to the idea that, hey, I'm never going to always make politically correct content or totally woke culture, things. But if I'm doing this self-work like you're talking about, then my art in a way will reflect this liberation that folks will see. Oh, and it makes it irresistible, ideally. It makes them hunger for this idea that, man, I want to be in a relationship with these other creatives, these folks of color, and that's why I feel like my biggest disconnect and loss growing up was wanting to be this writer, be this person who was only reading white authors. It was only, the loss of getting experience what other folks were putting out there in the world as their creative work.
Totally. I love that because it makes me think of one, it makes me think of like, I resonate with the fact that so many things that I didn't read or consume growing up that I read as an adult and was like, holy crap, like I can't believe that I didn't read. Like I just recently read the Autobiography of Malcolm X, and I can't believe I didn't read it when I was younger. I can't believe what I was told about it. It made me quite angry to think about the messages that I was told about Malcolm X versus reading him and understanding him in a more holistic way. That's baffling, but I can't believe I didn't read it when I was younger. I can't believe I never read Baldwin when I was younger. Baldwin is incredible. Some of the best literature, like what has to be one of the greatest American literary figures. I didn't read any Baldwin until like 4 years ago or something. But what I think the other thing that you said that really resonates and speaks to me is the fact that whatever you're doing personally is going to be reflected in your art. If you're a real artist, if you're putting your whole self into your art, whatever you do personally, your whole self has to be in your art. And those things can't be disconnected. If you're trying to do art that is reflective of a lens towards racial justice, and you're not doing the personal work, I think that's very dangerous. And ultimately, it's unhelpful. It's maybe not. I think it's unhelpful at some point. I think it's really dangerous.
Yeah, there's definitely been cases where I've read of folks who are definitely doing damage with their art. They're basically re-traumatizing, Black folks by making art that is speaking to slavery or, speaking to something that's very traumatic. And you're a white person. Do not tell me, why are you telling these people's story through this?
Well, and that can happen even when, so that hits home for me, because very recently I've been going through an experience where I've had to reflect on some of my work that was said to be re-triggering to people. And it was a project that wasn't released or hasn't been released to the public, and we've kind of put it on pause because of that. But that's to say that even like I can very honestly say that I have done work, that I have grown as a person, becoming less white in a way and interrogating my whiteness. And even doing that, I'm still and will always be entirely susceptible to cause harm, and to reify white supremacist thinking, white supremacy culture through my work. And in this case, what I think what specifically was happening was that I really had a lesson in what it means to center whiteness in the racial justice project, where it's so related to everything we talked about. So we were creating this game. This game was meant to be a classroom game to help folks, help high school students understand how personal self-interest and public policy meet each other, and created our segregated real estate, as well as contributed to the racial wealth gap. So in that space of the history of segregation, talking about redlining and blockbusting and gentrification, those types of things, but trying to do it through a game. And I created it myself and one another white person. We initiated the idea and then brought a couple Black people onto our team. And we had other people involved, other people of color involved in the process at various points. But the sort of main ownership of the game has always been myself and one other white person. We really pushed for, in this game, we want, if you win the game, we want you to feel that you won based on an unfair set of rules, because that's an accurate reflection of reality. That if you bought a home in Prairie Village in the 1940s and held on to that home, you'd have a huge amount of wealth accumulation because of the way that we appraise homes, yada, 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 redlining, etc. What we totally designed through a white lens, so that when a person of color played the game, eventually someone said, dude, this is triggering, because if I in the game, since in the game, you're given either you're basically given a role at the beginning of the game, and that role is going to tell you your income level and your race. And if you are signified as Black inside the game, you're just experiencing what you experience in everyday life in the game. But even worse, because in the game there was no hope given.
Wow.
And so realizing that and hearing that and sitting with that, I think it really has been a lesson for me in, wow, this is what it means to center whiteness, to center my own experience. And it underscores the importance to, earlier in the process, make sure that I'm creating with a diverse set of creators, not holding all of the voice myself, probably listening harder and giving up more of that creative process. I'm totally still processing that one. So if you have any insights from that story, I'm also happy to hear them.
Thanks for sharing that. I just know that like you said, I try to be a person who is vulnerable myself, and then just to bring that vulnerability to the space. Just know I see that, I recognize it, and just thanks for, because I know what it's like to write a book or reflect on something that's like, wow, that was like, I didn't realize, you're blindsided by it too. Again, that's the whole point about blindsides, right? We just don't see it. And so for me, I think what you've done through this process sounds like the best approach, to bring in those other voices that help speak to areas where you don't see. And I think just backing up even from the specific example to just the broader work of white folks, and how we just have to know we're going to make mistakes.
Yeah.
And have to give each other grace and compassion. And it doesn't mean that there's no accountability or there's no collective community around the mistakes or the things we do. But there is some approach of humility we have to bring to the table this, and not just for white folks, but for anyone who's trying to do anti-racism work, to realize that, hey, we're going to make mistakes. We're going to, either, cause ourselves harm or other people harm, and we have caused harm. I think the alternative, though, by saying I don't want to do this work is going to be even more harmful to ourselves.
That's right.
To each other. Right. So I think that at the end of the day, it sometimes can feel like, hey, doing anti-racism work feels like it's making us more racist. And then I ask myself, or is it just it's already there and we've just ignored it? We're just still, these dividing lines or this social conditioning. And
I think it's totally that. And I think that there has to be a huge amount of, I think something that's very compelling and maybe the most frightening thing is, with this game, there were people that played it as we've tested it and worked, and there were people that we played it that we may have harmed, but there are also the people on our team that we may have harmed. And I want to make sure that as a creator creating with other people, how do I not abuse or use the people of color, the Black people on the team for my own personal development? How do I, appropriately, give gratitude to them for wow, thank you for you being vulnerable to come into this process and create this thing with me because you took a risk working with me and another white guy. And in this case, that risk came with some fallout. So I want to give gratitude and credence to that effort. And also, I guess repent, to use the churchy word, but show to. I'm triggered. I feel genuinely. Oh yeah. I feel genuinely sorrowful. That the environment that we created wasn't a full manifestation of the world that we want to create. The process is as important as the outcome.
Yes.
Yeah.
And one day when we get to heaven, it'll all be right.
I'm triggered.
No, you're yeah, right. Well, hopefully when we bring heaven to earth, it'll be this beautiful, messy, but produce something beautiful kind of process in the midst of everything we're going through. I think our culture is having a big kind of internal groaning of identity in the U.S. and a culture as a whole.
Yeah.
And so maybe we can jump into some of the projects that are what you're working on now that have been creating space for other folks. You're talking about your podcast, Wide Ruled. Maybe you can share with us kind of what prompted you to start that.
Yeah.
That's tied to education as well.
Yeah. So Wide Ruled first started as a part of Brain Root Light and Sound, 4 or 5 years ago. Produced episodes for about a year and then went on a hiatus. I was spending 25 hours per episode in the worst case, because it was very much trying to be in the style of This American Life, where it's investigative reporting, and that became really unsustainable. Recently, I was really surprised by how people were continuing to listen to the old episodes, how I was getting fairly frequent comments of someone saying, yeah, I listened to your podcast the other day. And I was like, what? That podcast episode is 3 years old. So that positive encouragement made me decide I'll give this a go, hit up season 2 after a 3-year hiatus. So Wide Ruled is a podcast about education and justice. Whereas before it was investigative reporting, now it is more like what you and I are doing. We're having a conversation. We do try to keep it really topical, and focus on education and justice. So recently I referenced a conversation with Dr. Karma from the Black Archives, where we talk about the hashtag Teach Truth response to the anti-CRT movement in schools. There's in Kansas City, there's been so many publicized episodes of teachers using racial slurs or students doing wild things. Like recently, there was a petition started at Park Hill South where students were apparently petitioning for the return of slavery. So trying to address things like those and have conversations about where do we go from here, and trying to as you said, elevate the voices of people of color on that platform.
Wow, did not know that students were that. I'm just not surprised that folks, our youth, are going that direction. I'm going to be one of those old crotchety people one day that just, I mean, I know it's like generate everyone when they get older, like, those dang youth. But I swear to God, like the friends who are teachers, they talk about every year how every year kindergartners are just more and more maliciously evil.
Oh, yikes.
But maybe that's their own experience. I don't know. I feel like if that's how they experience it every year, then maybe that's a reflection more on them and how they're, I don't know. But
oh no, maybe. That's funny.
I digress. But I was part of the Kaufman Education Fellowship earlier this year, and their kind of goal with that project is to kind of bring cross-sector folks from different walks of life, people who are entrepreneurs, people who are in education, but basically trying to address like education injustice, like racial disparities in education through community, like through bringing in folks who are part of different walks of life to basically organize and be advocates for equity in education. I have a full-time job outside, so I never got to go full-fledged. There's a second year to it. I decided to turn down. Just my life was just, again, one of the things I had to step back and realize as a white person, I can't save the world and be a part of everything. And I can only say yes to so many things, and it's okay. You know that.
Yeah.
I have to think about my own self-care, and
it hits home.
Kind of one of my own personal learning journeys. But it was really, powerful experience going through that first year of the fellowship anyways, to learn about the history of this area that I've lived in my whole life and understand, the segregation and how it impacted schools, how we try to create magnet schools to bring white folks back, and basically weren't actually putting the students first in these schools. We were just like, hey, let's build a huge pool, an Olympic-sized pool, and let's just build these things to try and draw white folks back. And it had
Central Academy.
Right. And that's kind of what your project, the Dividing Lines project, kind of speaks to as well. Is that kind of still going, or what can
Yeah. So back in 2018, I got to work with the Johnson Race Project KC and the Johnson County Library to really take a tour that they had been doing for a couple of years, on buses with a teacher and a bullhorn, talking to students, driving around Kansas City, talking about the history of segregation and some of the landmarks. We got the opportunity back in 2018 to try to create a digital experience that could further give access to that same information in that tour. And as a storyteller, as a documentary producer, really wanted to take it and weave it into a story, as opposed to before that it was kind of a list of facts. So the Dividing Lines tour is really a cinematic experience. It's a 25-mile tour of the history of segregation in Kansas City. Starts at Shawnee Mission East High School in Prairie Village, ends in the Ivanhoe neighborhood, at the Ivanhoe Community Center. And I'm so happy to say that over 8,000 people have taken the tour. Earlier this year, in early 2021, we completed a virtual reality edition of the tour that you can. So originally you would, and you can still do this, you can download the Voice Map app and experience it in your car driving through the city. It's like a combination of Google Maps and a podcast. Now you can experience it from the comfort of your own couch through YouTube or through a VR headset. Right now, you can find that tour on the Johnson County Library's YouTube page, Dividing Lines Tour Part 1, 2, and 3. And I think that so the point of the tour is to give meaning to our built environment so that we can understand that our spaces are segregated with intent, on purpose, that it isn't a matter of what I learned growing up, which was just that, like, oh yeah, all the Black people live together because, you know, birds of a feather flock together. But it's actually, it was something, yeah, it was built on purpose. It was white people white people have always had the option to live wherever the heck they want, but people of color in this country have not, and specifically Black people have very much not. And that's, as I said earlier, contributed to the racial wealth gap, and a host of other life outcomes and ills, access to resource and opportunity, etc. But I think something that we really wanted to focus on in the tour, beyond just that history, was also that the way that history played out was by people doing business as usual or best practices, following just good business. So we feature the story of Sid Williams, who died a civil rights activist, a civil rights lawyer, in his obituary. He actually died right after the tour was completed, but he tells a story about how he sort of accidentally fell into funding, bankrolling blockbusting activities. And that when he realized that he had made that mistake, he actually went to Washington to lobby the government to say, we've got to stop the Section 235 program, which has these deleterious effects on the city, and is taking advantage of Black people as they move out of the ghettos where they've been forced to live. And the moral of that story is twofold. One, like, it gets back to this thing about people recognizing their mistakes and changing. Like, we all have that opportunity to recognize their mistakes and change and improve. But also, I think it should be a lesson for all of us that if we don't take the time to carefully consider our actions, carefully consider what we consider to be best practices, especially in specifically in this country, when we have 400 years of racist policy, we will perpetuate inequitable systems if we don't take a hard look and question best practices. There's no need for current policies to mention race in order to have racially disparate and inequitable outcomes. And that's something that we try to really focus on in the Dividing Lines tour.
That's one, yeah. I think what's scary about what you're talking about is not only can we perpetuate these things just by doing what today just normal business, but now the movement also towards let's actually subvert, critical race theory. Let's actually try to erase the past and let's not talk about it. Or even like what they're doing now with technology. They're talking about AI systems that are now racist because the people, the coders, are fucking embedding like data that is being like perpetuating stereotypes. And so now we have AI systems that are
absolutely.
Like, oh, you're gonna become this is your gonna outcome gonna be this Black person because this is what the white data. I don't know. They're just things like
that's a huge thing. I just yesterday finished reading a book by Sophia Umoja Noble, called Algorithms of Oppression, which is about Google search and the Google search algorithms and how it's procuring information in a racist way that Google has repeatedly pointed to their algorithm, said, oh no, their algorithm itself isn't racist. It's just the way that it works. But her point repeatedly in the book is that, like, that's not an answer. Like, saying that technology, which was built by humans, is just the way it works, it's really irresponsible, and it's furthering inequity.
To our listeners, if you want to do a little test project, go to Google, just type in beautiful woman or beautiful man and see what imagery it brings up. Well, Nathaniel, I promised I would keep things within this time constraint because I know you got other things you got to be doing. where can we find you online? Where does thou live on the
I dose to live in multiple places. I think of myself as being extremely accessible online, maybe too much. I don't know. It hasn't been too much so far. You can find me on Instagram at BO_Nathaniel, Bo_Nathaniel. My last name is Bozarth, so it's the first two last names of my thing. I also go by Bo sometimes. No one calls me that. They used to.
Bo? Dang.
Yeah, Bo.
That cool kid who has the inside scoop on your.
Yeah. I'm on TikTok as well. Same thing, Bo_Nathaniel. You can find my podcast Wide Ruled on most likely whatever podcast platform you're currently listening on. You can find Wide Ruled. Wide Ruled comes out once every 2 weeks ish. Sometimes there's bonus episodes here and there. Yeah, look me up.
Yeah, appreciate you, Bo. Boo. I'm gonna call you Boobo. My Boobo. And y'all know you can find me my personal accounts at MJ Chrisman on all your social medias, and also Pray for Micah Pod for Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and even TikTok. I feel like a total millennial boomer or whatever. I made the outro for this podcast that'll play here soon for the listener. And I say it just like that, and I was gonna edit it out, so I'm not saying and even TikTok. But I feel like it goes back to it speaks to the underscore of this show, which is Pray for Micah. He's out here trying to relate to the youngsters,
I feel that too. I feel like it's even TikTok. I felt like there was a big learning, I felt super old. I'm 30. I'm not that old, but TikTok felt like a big reach, and I feel like I've started to get it. I feel like I'm decent at TikTok. Yeah.
I'm not there yet at all. Nope. I'm just gonna be.
Well, I'm gonna follow you on TikTok. We gotta follow each other on TikTok.
Yeah, follow me.
I need peers on TikTok, because I don't have many peers on TikTok. There's just other. Yeah, I don't know.
Funny folks you follow. Yeah, I'm at MJ Chrisman is what that's the main one I've posted. I haven't posted anything for the Pray for Micah pod on TikTok yet.
Well, folks, pray for Micah and I on TikTok, and pray tell if there's things we can do to be better on TikTok, because I'm just trying to figure it out.
Hey, appreciate you again for being here, and we'll see you next time, everybody.
Awesome. Thanks, Micah.
Yeah. Thanks for joining me for the Pray for Micah podcast. Be sure to like and subscribe on this channel, and follow me on social media. Pray for Micah Pod on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and yes, even TikTok. We'll see you next time.
You are now re-entering the normal world.